So this is the moment that many of us have been waiting for. A comparison between the 16 and 14-inch MacBook Pro on the base configuration. This will also be a review and a real-world review for the 14-inch MacBook Pro as well, so let's find out together. This is Artist Right. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. This will be a longer video with a lot of information covered, so if you want to jump ahead to the section you want to view, there's timestamp in the description below. Both of the computers that I have here, the new ones, are still running on the M1 Pro processor, and the focus of this one will be on the 14-inch model. But because of the way how I have configured these machines, there are a few different metrics that we can compare these machines and start to extrapolate the data. Starting with the test and reference system that I have, these are the systems that I've used to do a test. What I am going to do is remove the 24-inch iMac because the results for the M1 processor are pretty much very similar to each other, with the exception being the MacBook Air M1 because it doesn't have a fan, so it tends to take longer at performing tasks. I believe that when the processor gets hot, pretty much the system throttle down the frequency of the CPU, slowing down the process in general. So the test setup is what you're seeing right now. With the two machines we're going to focus on is the 14 and 16-inch model. For the 14-inch model, this is not entirely truly a base. It is running on the base processor, but I upgraded the RAM to 32 gigabytes, and there are some benefits that you may have not thought about on this one. For this one, this is a 16-inch model with an upgraded SSD to 1 terabyte, and that's the only thing that's upgraded. Everything else is still pretty much base configuration with 16 gigabytes of memory. I have one more test system coming in, and this is the M1 Max with 32-core GPU, 64 gigabytes of unified memory. Although, if you ask me right now, I don't really think that this processor is going to do much more to improve the performance of these two already. I could be wrong, but we shall see. So make sure you stay tuned for that. All right, quickly, we got to talk about some of the aspects of this machine, starting out with the design, size, and weight. If I didn't mind the screen size, I would probably get a 14-inch one for myself because I really love the weight for this machine. It's powerful, it's super lightweight, and everything about it is very similar to the bigger model. The only difference is that I like the larger screen much better. So that's why I choose to order myself a 16-inch model. But again, if I didn't really mind working on a smaller screen, I would probably choose the 14-inch model. There's a lot to like about this one. Ports, obviously, I said already made its way back. I'm not going to cover that anymore. The power brick that ships with this machine, the one I got, is a 67-watt one. That means you cannot do fast charging on here. So this is something to keep in mind, especially if you order the 14-inch base machine. You want to spend that extra $20 and upgrade that to a 96-watt power adapter in order for you to be able to fast charge your computer. And you can fast charge the 14-inch using either the MagSafe or a USB Type-C. On the 16-inch model, you can only fast charge by MagSafe, even if you're using the 140 brick power adapter. So FYI there. SSD speed. There's a lot of conversation about this, and I hear people asking me, some have been recommending you should get more SSD because it is faster. Well, it is, but do you really need it? That's the main question. I still think that the SSD on these machines, if you see the speed comparison between the 1 terabyte in the 16-inch MacBook Pro and the 512 gigabyte in the 14-inch, they're pretty much within a hair of each other. And the only way as a photographer to really saturate all this bandwidth is that you have to shoot CF Express Type B card. Those are the one that looks like the XQD card that can read at 1700 megabyte per second and saturate the bandwidth by downloading 3 of those cards simultaneously to a computer to even saturate the bandwidth for what these computers can do. Do you really need that? Probably not. So I would get the SSD based on the size that you want to use, but just some factoid information there. The built-in display with the calibration process, I have a video already out, or if it's not out yet, it will be out soon. But these are amazing, fantastic display, and they are probably one of the best displays that Apple have ever shipped with really great, amazing color accuracy. External calibration is not an issue with a software or hardware calibrated display. I have tested this, so it works just fine. Something to remember is that depending on how many display you want to hook up to your system, M1 Pro will only link up to 2 external ones, M1 Max will link up to 4. And here are some of the real-world benchmarks, starting with Lightroom Classic. This is the one that we really want to know about because I always speculated that if we have more RAM, the system is going to run faster. Not quite. So these are 1,000 files, and obviously you have found my test methodology already that I don't really do just 100 files that doesn't even warm up the system. I want to see how the system perform in duration. And this is kind of like a marathon run for the machine. So what we can see so far is that the 14-inch base with 32 gigabytes of memory does not necessarily perform faster because these tasks are really heavy CPU based. They don't use RAM as much. What I've been finding out is that Lightroom reached a plateau for RAM when it comes to these export-import tasks, and pretty much it doesn't use any more than that. So that's what I've been finding out. And when we compare this to the rest of the lineup, you can see how the timing shows up right now. Personally, between these two machines, if you want to get the smaller one, I'd probably go with the 14-inch base model, but I probably upgrade the RAM. And you're going to see in a moment why you may want to do that, depending on your workflow. Let's look at the export result and what we're getting here. So the time is just a smidgen longer than each other. We're looking at 18 or 19 minutes versus, for example, 21 minutes and like 24 seconds. So a minute or two longer. It's really not that bad considering this have 2 less high performance core than that machine. Personally, I would go with the base one and save the money from buying the upgrade 16-inch, or just save the money from upgrading the processor in general. And I would never think that I would recommend this configuration, but for the money you're saving, use that for the RAM upgrade. You're going to see the benefit why. This is comparing between all the other machines. Feel free to pause these slides and just look at them if you like to linger on a little bit longer. And I've also did a 1K export on battery. You can kind of see comparing between the 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro and these two machines right here. This one, obviously, because it has less core, it does take a little bit longer. But again, it's within that margin of error, like a few minutes. It's not really that bad at all. For instance, on the 16-inch MacBook Pro that's supposed to be the top-of-the-line Intel machine in 2019, that took 10 minutes longer. I mean, that's a really good comparison to see right there. As for battery life, the Intel one drops down to 51%. On the 16-inch one, because it has a larger battery, it drops down to 91%, and this one drops down to 87%. All respectable. I mean, we're doing a lot of tasks here and is able to maintain the battery. The efficiency for these machines are just really awesome. Fan noise, when I'm running Lightroom, it's like the perfect program to test fan noise. That's another reason why I run this. It just quietly hums. You can still hear it, but it's not quite as loud as, for instance, my 16-inch MacBook Pro that, like I said, if it has wings, it will take off from a runway. All right, let's now talk about Lightroom HDR Merge. Comparing these two machines, well, the results are pretty much within margin of error each other. Nothing is really faster or slower. This is a CPU intensive task, not a lot of RAM involved here. And when we compare this to any of the other machines, I mean, obviously, right now, these machines are faster than the Intel machine for HDR Merge, and that is a great thing to have. However, when we come into the Panorama Merge, this is taking 14 Nikon DA10 file and stitching it together to create a 314 megapixel image. Let's see how this compares. At first, when I ran this, I have to do the test again and again because I was so shocked that this machine was faster than the 16-inch machine that has a better processor. This is running on the base processor here. 8-core CPU, 14-core GPU. How is this faster? And then it clicked on me. This one has more RAM, 32 gigabytes of RAM versus 16. So if your workflow involves large files, if your workflow involves panoramic stitches, get 32 gigabytes of RAM because this is showing a clear benefit here. Now, I want to see how the 64 gigabytes is going to compare to this when we get that machine in. So, like I said, stay tuned for that one. Panorama Merge compare with all the rest. I mean, this machine with 32 gigabytes memory beats out the Mac Pro 2019 was the champ. When I test all of these machines last week, it was the champ still, even against the upgraded CPU 16-inch MacBook Pro. But with this one, just the base configuration with more RAM, it already beats that and has been crowned king. Capture One. Well, Capture One hasn't really been upgraded to utilize all of these codecs in the machine yet, the new processor. Even though like it's running just fine, I think that Capture One can do a lot more. So we shall see if they release an update that will optimize their software even more for these new M1 Pros and M1 Max processor. But so far, what I have gone through is imported 1,000 files and generated the preview for 5,120 pixels. The time between these two machines, I mean, they're pretty much within a few minutes of each other. For the price point differences, I would say they're pretty much neck and neck. 28 minutes, 42 seconds, while this one is 31 minutes and 12 seconds. We're really talking about maybe about a minute and a half for 2 more CPU cores. Like I said, the base one is really doing just fine. For the price differences, I mean, this is really a compelling machine. Comparing to the rest of the lineup, obviously these new M1s are really beating out the Intel, even the Mac Pro, when we're generating the previews, which is really awesome. So now let's have a look at the export. This is export using the GPU processing power inside these machines. So a couple things to think about here: 14 core GPU, 16 core GPU. Between the difference of those two cores comes out to about a minute and a half. That's really not that big at all. What I want to see though is that when we apply the M1 Max with 32 core, how much more of a performance improvement are we going to get? And just in case if you're wondering, using the software to do the adjustment is really smooth on here. The processor would keep up with it just fine even on the 14 core model. So that's kind of interesting there. Export comparison with all the other machines I have in the lineup, just to give us an idea. So having more RAM right now for Capture One doesn't really do much, and it does utilize the GPU, but having the extra 2 GPU cores doesn't really do much in terms of speed for export. I mean, there is a difference, but that's really marginal for the price point that you're really paying. Photoshop test. I'm using Lloyd Chamber script that he has created. I'll put a link to his script in the description below, but let's take a look first at Photoshop speed, comparing 70% RAM and 90% RAM. Well, obviously, this Photoshop speed test is more CPU intensive task, so it does take a little bit longer compared to the 16-inch model because that one has more CPU. This one has 2 less CPU core, the high performance one. Comparing with the rest, with the Intel and the M1 lineup, you can kind of get an idea there. But let's take a look at Photoshop Medium. And this is where the conversations start to track in. If you are working with large files, if you're doing composite, if you're working with Photoshop, pay the money and get 32 gigabytes of memory because that is definitely going to be worth it. The reason why is because you can now see that pretty much the time drops almost by half when you have double the amount of RAM. So at 70% RAM, it took a little bit longer on the 16-inch MacBook Pro, 14 seconds to run this test. This one took 8 seconds. That is almost half. And it's even more significant when we increase the RAM to 90%. When we do that, we now have 14 seconds on this one. This is pretty much still at half, 7 seconds. So the best thing to do, especially if you're working with large composite, is to definitely spring out for more RAM because that definitely does help. Comparison between all the Intel machines, feel free to pause this, and all the other M1s of the past. And last one we're going to look at is Photoshop Huge. This is also interesting. So taking a look at this, having more RAM definitely is of a benefit because for this one, instead of taking 2 minutes and 17 seconds or so to process and work on this 56 gigabyte file, it took only a minute and 28 seconds. This is a big and huge enough improvement in time that if you do a lot of these things, get more RAM, it is definitely worth it. And Photoshop Huge comparison between all the other machines. Right now, the Mac Pro 2019 with 96 gigabytes of memory is still the king, but I don't know. I think that when we get the M1 Max in with 64 gigabytes of memory, that machine might blow out my Mac Pro out of water. We shall see. It's going to be interesting. And I also want to share with you a Final Cut export just to give us an idea how these machines perform compared to each other. I mean, they're pretty much the same, exporting this Panasonic 4K 8-bit 420 clip into H.264. Comparing with the rest, this still has yet to beat out the Mac Pro, but it's getting much closer. And if we take a look at exporting this into HEVC, this is pretty much H.265. The time, again, is pretty much head-to-head of each other. This is the reason why, if you're just looking at the M1 Pro processor, I'm changing my recommendation. Don't upgrade. Just go with the base one and upgrade the RAM instead. It's much more beneficial. But here's the thing. If you just work on video app, I mean, RAM doesn't really do much here. But if you work on After Effects, for instance, you'll probably see a bigger difference in the RAM consumption, and you definitely want to upgrade in that situation. HEVC compare with all the other M1's computer and Intel machine. And lastly, ProRes 422, which is also interesting because there is a decoder encoder engine for all these codecs that I'm sharing with you right now, which is pretty much showing us that we're kind of maxing out on the performance here. I want to go back a little bit here and talk about the HEVC, for instance. This is pretty much taking just a slight bit longer than what the M1 processor can do. So my guess is that they probably took the same engine and just kind of brought it over and really didn't do much change there. That would be my speculation. All right, ProRes 422, again, same encoder, same amount of time. I'm hoping that the M1 Max would drop these time down in half. That would be impressive because it has 2 encoder decoder engine for ProRes. So we shall see if that's happening or not. And here's the result comparing this to all the Intel machine. This pretty much cuts the time in half. I mean, this is already impressive, but like I said, if the M1 Max can cut this even further and make this like a quarter of all the other bars, that would make it super awesome. So, best laptop for Pro. Let me give you another recap here. MacBook Pro, obviously. The minimum specs that you probably want to look at if you're configuring a machine today. CPU, GPU, let's talk about that first. If you're choosing a 14-inch model, you know what? Go with the base one. I mean, this is really impressive. This base model can do so much more than a much more expensive machine at a price point that is absolutely amazing. And if you're choosing, for instance, the 16-inch model, then I would still also go with the base one as of now, especially if you're doing photography, and just literally add in more RAM to the system. That's going to give you the most benefit. So, as I mentioned, M1 Pro, you can upgrade to a max of 32. M1 Max, you can go up to 64. I really want to see how the M1 Max performs, so I will definitely keep you posted on it. I know that probably many of you want to see the result too, and I am definitely curious. I want to see if that processor is going to definitely improve the performance of the machine overall or not really so much. If you're really looking at the CPU task though, for example, Lightroom import, Lightroom export, or a Capture One import, for instance, that just uses the CPU on the system, I don't think that going to the M1 Max is going to increase the performance by that much because it is still the same 10-core CPU with the 8 high performance and 2 efficiency core. Like I said, I don't think we're going to see that much more improvement from there in the photo app. That's why I'm recommending just to go with the base processor. It will do the job just fine, but upgrading RAM is definitely going to make a difference, especially if you work with large files. There's also one more thing I want to mention too, and I'll have a separate video on this doing a demo in Lightroom. I found out that when the system is doing a swap between, for example, the memory on the system to the SSD, yes, it's fast, but it's not quite as fast as the RAM. And when that happens, you get that spinning beach ball that happens in Lightroom. And I'll make a demonstration really clear in a separate video. SSD, 1 terabyte is the sweet spot. Buy the size that you want. Don't worry about the speed. It's going to be difficult to saturate that unless you're really constantly shooting like 8K footage from like these big high-end cameras, to which, I mean, if you need to work on the road, that's fine, but you probably want a powerful desktop system to work on those files anyhow. Specialty. This is what we have to think about now. One size fit all machine is no longer the case. Upgrading to everything is kind of not really worth it today anymore. So let's have a look at the tasks that you are doing. For example, if you are using Adobe app and you're doing only processing heavy application, for example, importing, exporting, Lightroom, doing some minor image editing, then I would probably go with these base configuration. And if you want to stick with the 16GB model, you can certainly do that without any problems. But if you go in and start to merge Panorama, you start to do all these things that works with larger files, that requires compositing, working in Photoshop, doing extensive retouching, I definitely recommend going for the 32GB of RAM because that's going to minimize system swapping to the SSD, and it definitely does increase the speed. And there are certain tests that I've showed you already here that show a clear benefit. And the other creative areas that we have to think about here is pretty much for photographer. If you're using Capture One, I'm putting the M1 Max there with a question mark because I really don't know how much better it's going to perform, but I would definitely test that and let you know. And lastly, if you're a video pro, I still recommend M1 Max as of now because of the double encoder decoder engine. But again, without testing, we shall see how good that performance is going to be on that processor. So that is still pending. Like I said, one more machine is coming soon. Stay tuned to the channel. We'll give you some more thoughts about this whole thing and which is the best configuration. But so far, if you're a photographer, I think you can already gather from the data here the medium spot that you may want to go with. If you are doing video and photography tasks together, you're doing mixed medium creative, what I would probably do is choose the highest common denominator. For example, if a processor, for example, the M1 Max is going to benefit in Final Cut Pro, then I would probably choose that so that it trickles down through the rest. But otherwise, I don't really see the point going any higher than this. So really love this 14-inch model. Anyway, stay tuned for more information that is coming soon. So questions or comments, leave them below, give this a like, subscribe and hit on the bell if you're new, and remember, in art we trust.